So in Chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald starts off with a lot of different names which you can see here, and I picked out a lot of the ones that basically deal with animals. You can see Leeches, you can see Civet, Hornbeams, Blackbuck, Beaver, Fishguards, Whitebait, all different types of fish, birds, and different types of animals. And the reason why Fitzgerald does it is because obviously he wants us to know that these aren't really people. They're the kind of people that prey on Gatsby. They're not very nice people. They're just herded around what Tom later calls Gatsby's menagerie, which is just a collection of animals. It's like being at a zoo essentially, and they're all show animals as well, because obviously they're from the upper class. That could be old money upper class, new money upper class, but this is what Gatsby is doing to try and impress Daisy, or to try and gather people that might be in the same circle as Daisy. And so yeah, he names them all after different types of animals. So I've got this fancy term here. Nomenclature is basically it's very specific, and it just means basically that it's Fitzgerald's naming technique. But yeah, they're the ones that prey on Gatsby, and at the same time it's weird to think that Gatsby aspires to be like them. He wants to fit into this crowd. And so later on he changes his name to Jay, which is just a type of bird. So maybe, just like all these different characters here, he wants to be one of these characters in order to impress Daisy, to appear as though he's the same status as her, so that she will accept him. If we move on, we come to this quotation, which I think is also a very good quotation. It was a rich cream colour, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length. And here Fitzgerald is using a lot of phallic imagery basically. So Gatsby's car resembles, or is described in, well, phallic terms, it resembles a penis basically. It calls Fitzgerald's narrator Nick's sexuality into question. So he's obviously admiring the car, and as such it suggests that he might be admiring Gatsby and Gatsby's, well, car supposedly. Later on we have the idea that Gatsby has a facade, and he does all the way through, but Nick obviously sees through it. So he was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is distinctly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting rope. And I've picked on the words I suppose here. It's really vague in terms of how Nick is describing it, and it probably hints to us that Nick has his doubts about Gatsby, that he doesn't necessarily think that this facade is the truth. And so it conveys to us, the reader, a slight suspicion from Fitzgerald's narrator, Nick in this case. And again, later on we've got the absence of lifting work over here. And so Gatsby wants to convey that he's never worked manually. And so it means that he just wants to appear as though he's genteel, as though he's well-bred, as though he's never had to do any work in his life. We obviously know that's a lie from later on in the novel, when it tells us that he's the son of shiftless farm people, because clearly it means that he will have been doing work on the farm where he used to live. So it is another part of the facade that he projects to Nick. Later on then we can see obviously Nick is able to see it breaking, so the quality was continually breaking. Nick was raised in that class. Nick is old money upper class, despite the fact that he's not particularly wealthy. But he was raised in that class with good breeding, good education, and so he sees the gaps in Gatsby's facade, and basically Gatsby doesn't know. He doesn't understand how actually it's easy for somebody in that class to spot that this is just a facade. So yeah, Gatsby wants to be part of this old money upper class. Nick is part of that class, and he can see that Gatsby does not fit in straight away, and he tells us basically. Later on we have this quotation here. A limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 modish negroes, 2 bucks, and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yokes of their eyeballs rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Nick is using quite derogatory language to describe black people here. He calls them bucks, basically, which is a reference to an animal, because of the segregation and the racism that was apparent back in the 1920s when this was being written in 1925. And so, yeah, it's not particularly nice language. However, when it comes to later on, it says that anything can happen. The idea that 3 black people were being driven by a white chauffeur there is something that is, at this time, something quite absurd. It doesn't really happen. And so Nick finds it kind of amusing, even laughs aloud basically, that they consider themselves rivals when he talks about this haughty rivalry. And so he finds it kind of amazing, but he thinks that, well, if 3 black people can be driven by a white person, then anything can happen, and anything can happen we've got here. So despite this poor facade of Gatsby, despite the fact that actually, because Nick sees through it all the time, maybe it's something that he can start to believe in. And so he says even Gatsby could happen later on. It says, yeah, if black people can be served by white people, maybe Gatsby could be real. Maybe this ridiculous story that Gatsby is telling him could be real. So later, we're introduced to Wolfsheim. And Wolfsheim is described in this kind of ferocious, horrible way. So we discovered his tiny eyes in the darkness. These tiny eyes, it means that it's hard to actually look at him in the eyes and get the measure of this person, basically. And the idea that his eyes are shrouded in darkness suggests something really sinister about him, as do the tiny eyes themselves. So they're kind of hidden away from Nick, and he can't see the reality of Wolfsheim. And we get this fantastic oxymoron here, this ferocious delicacy, this like aggressive, violent delicacy, which is a brilliant oxymoron. It suggests to us that on the surface, Wolfsheim is really kind of civilized, genteel, polite, and underneath, actually, he's probably this kind of really dangerous predator. Again, he fits into the same kind of trope as these people up here. He's a wolf, and so he's named after an animal, just like a lot of the well-off people in the Great Gatsby. If we go a little bit further, you've got this finest specimen of human molars there, which is really kind of creepy. And the idea that he's wearing teeth is very much like a gangster quality. Obviously, this was a time of prohibition where alcohol was illegal, which meant that basically the American mobs start forming, and we get lots and lots of gangsterism, which is where people can make a huge amount of money, just like Gatsby, in a very short space of time. And then basically we're left to question, where did he get these teeth? And the idea that he removes these teeth is like basically taking care of the competition, removing the threat, removing the teeth of his competition, which says that he is a ferocious, horrible person that has been involved in this kind of violent gangsterism, and that's why he's so successful. Later on then, we've got our introduction to Tom and Daisy's wedding. So we've got a string of pearls that Tom gives her, and it's this like really materialistic thing that he gives her, a huge symbol of enormous wealth. And you've got to bear in mind that pearls back then, it's not as if they can be created artificially now like they can nowadays. They were very rare and very hard to come by, so a huge string of pearls is an enormous elaborate show of wealth, which Tom gives to Daisy. And it's kind of like, you know, you put this around your neck and he possesses you, you belong to him. So later on you've got this simile, drunk as a monkey. This is obviously when Daisy's going through reading Gatsby's letter that he's just sent to her, despite the fact that she's now engaged to Tom and about to be married to him. And so she's drinking because she's finding the whole situation far too tragic and is remarkably upset. She's giving up this dream of an actual loving relationship to be with somebody that, yeah, they can provide for her, but she doesn't necessarily love. Similarly, later on you've got the "it was coming to pieces like snow." This is Gatsby's letter, so obviously it's gotten damp and it's now like falling apart, and it's probably to symbolise how the romance between Gatsby and Daisy is basically coming to an end. It's fragmenting basically, and it's fragmenting against like, well, Tom, and how Tom takes over as the main man in Daisy's life. And I've said that there's a key contrast between pearls here and this paper that's coming together like snow. Obviously one's a show of wealth and one's a show of poverty, so the paper cost nothing, the pearls cost a fortune. Later we have this fantastic quotation. We have, "He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendour," which is a great metaphor by Fitzgerald. It's basically telling us that it's a moment of rebirth, that's why it's the womb that's being used, and it's a revelation for Nick. Gatsby is reborn in Nick's eyes because actually all of the parties, all of the elaborate show and the facade, all of the expense that he goes to, it all makes sense. So in this moment, Gatsby's reborn for Nick, and Nick stops judging him as somebody that tells him secrets like all the other men from Chapter 1, and like the kind of people that he dislikes because he doesn't want to know their personal business, and all of a sudden it's all got a reason. And so Nick suddenly finds him amazing. And again, just to continue that, you've got he dispensed starlight to casual moths, so you could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. And I've got the juxtaposition of starlight and casual moths and starlight and come over, because there's something so modest about come over. It's a quick general meeting, whereas actually starlight is something amazing. And so he's giving starlight out to casual moths, people that don't necessarily deserve it. This menagerie that we talked about earlier, just so he could get basically a small moment's time with Daisy. And so he tolerates all the animals at his party as a means to reunite with Daisy. Basically, that's what we're talking about. And I said it links to his romantic readiness for hope, which we talked about in Chapter 1. Because essentially he's spending such a fortune in order to be able to reunite with Daisy. He's going to such huge lengths to reunite with Daisy, and we see it in this quotation. The last thing that I've got then is at the end here. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, and so I drew up the girl beside me tight in my arms. This is the start of Nick's relationship with Jordan. And it's not exactly the best motive for a relationship, the idea that he's somewhat jealous of Gatsby and Tom Buchanan because they have a sense of romance and they're looking for something. So I suggested that obviously Gatsby is looking for Daisy and Tom's looking for that irrecoverable football game that he talks about in Chapter 1, when Tom's life was like at the peak basically, and he was a star at college football.